The Mississippi River isn't simply a river, it's the backbone of North America. Stretching roughly on 2,140 miles, it gathers water from 32 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces, draining more than 41% of the continental United States before emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. Every second, nearly 593,000 cubic feet of water flows past New Orleans under normal conditions, powering one of the busiest waterways on Earth and supporting hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity every year. But commerce is only part of its story. For more than 2.5 centuries, the Mississippi has carried the weight of a growing nation. It transported settlers searching for new lives, enslaved people forced into unimaginable journeys, soldiers marching toward war, farmers sending crops to distant markets, factories shipping their products, and countless travelers chasing opportunity. Every major chapter of American expansion passed through this river, yet the Mississippi demanded a price. Powerful currents, hidden snags, violent floods, shifting channels, and devastating fires claimed thousands of vessels over the generations. Steamboats exploded without warning. Barges disappeared beneath the current. Civil War gunboats were destroyed in battle and swallowed by the river. Entire riverside communities were erased as the Mississippi carved new paths across its floodplain. According to estimates from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the riverbed now holds the remains of more than 7,000 sunken vessels. For decades, nearly all of them remained hidden beneath layers of mud and sediment, forgotten by everyone except historians and local legends. That changed when the river itself began to retreat. Beginning in 2022 and continuing through 2023 and 2024. Unusually severe drought conditions pushed the Mississippi to some of the lowest water levels ever recorded in modern history. Government agencies, including the National Weather Service and the Army Corps of Engineers, described the situation as extraordinary, with navigation becoming increasingly difficult along much of the lower river. Massive barges became stranded where deep channels once existed. Sandbars rose above the surface in places that had been underwater for generations. Emergency dredging operations were launched simply to keep vital shipping routes open and prevent major disruptions to American trade. But while engineers focused on keeping commerce moving, something unexpected was happening beneath the shrinking waterline. As the river exposed sections of its ancient bed, long-buried pieces of America's past began emerging into daylight. Shipwrecks that had vanished more than a century ago suddenly became visible again. Fragments of forgotten towns appeared where maps no longer showed any settlements. Historic cargo, abandoned equipment, and traces of communities the river had erased slowly resurfaced after spending generations beneath layers of mud. Historians, archaeologists, government officials, and even descendants of families connected to these places quietly began documenting what the river was revealing. Some discoveries were carefully preserved, others were intentionally covered again to protect them from damage or looting. Many researchers now believe these discoveries represent one of the largest accidental archaeological events in modern American history. And some of the findings tell stories that rarely appear in history books. Stories of vanished settlements, mysterious sinkings, missing cargo, forgotten disasters, and human remains connected to tragedies that were never fully documented. It's as though the Mississippi has started opening a time capsule that has remained sealed for more than 200 years. To understand why so much history is buried beneath this river, you have to remember what the Mississippi once represented. Long before interstate highways, railroads, or commercial aviation connected America, this river served as the nation's primary transportation network. Nearly everything traveled on its waters. Cotton from southern plantations, wheat and corn harvested across the Midwest, timber from northern forests, coal from mining regions, manufactured goods from growing industrial cities, livestock, machinery, furniture, whiskey, textiles, weapons, and supplies destined for ports along the Gulf Coast all relied on the Mississippi to reach their destination. The river didn't just move cargo. It moved people. families heading west in search of land and opportunity, soldiers traveling to remote frontier forts and later to the battlefields of the Civil War. Merchants, laborers, immigrants, and adventurers all shared the same waterway, making the Mississippi the lifeline of an expanding nation, and leaving behind a history that is only now beginning to resurface. Merchants, gamblers, preachers, conmen, entertainers, and every other category of 19th century American humanity crowded onto the steamboats that churned up and down the river, in numbers that modern Americans find difficult to comprehend. At the peak of the steamboat era, in the decades before the Civil War, over 4,000 steamboats were operating on the Mississippi River system. They ran continuously, day and night, summer and winter, carrying passengers and cargo on schedules that the shipping companies maintained regardless of weather, visibility, or the condition of the vessels themselves. The boats were not safe. Steamboat technology in the mid-19th century was inherently dangerous. The boilers that powered the paddle wheels operated under pressures that the metallurgy of the era could not reliably contain. Explosions were common. Fires were common. The wooden hulls that dominated the industry until the late 19th century burned quickly and completely once ignited. The river itself was a hazard. The Mississippi's channel shifts constantly. Sandbars form and reform with every flood cycle. Submerged logs, called sawyers and planters in the terminology of the era, lurked beneath the surface, capable of punching through a wooden hull with no warning. Navigation was by eyesight and experience, not instrumentation. Pilots who knew the river could read its currents and avoid its dangers. Pilots who did not know the river or who were operating in conditions that exceeded their knowledge regularly ran their vessels onto obstructions that tore them apart. And then there were the collisions. There were 4,000 steamboats operating on a single river system. Many raced each other for competitive advantage. Many operated at night without adequate lighting. Many were commanded by captains who prioritized speed over safety. The collision rate was staggering. The boats went down. They went down by the dozens, by the hundreds, by the thousands over the course of the 19th century. The Army Corps of Engineers estimates that over 7,000 vessels of all types lie on the bottom of the Mississippi River system. The actual number may be higher. Many sinkings were never formally reported. Many vessels that went down in remote stretches of the river were simply abandoned where they sank. Their loss absorbed as a cost of doing business on a waterway that killed boats as routinely as it carried cargo. The wrecks accumulated. The river buried them. And for over a century, the sediment of the Mississippi, the constant flow of mud and silt that gives the river its brown color and its fertile delta, covered what had been lost. Until the water dropped. The drought that began affecting the Mississippi River Basin in 2022 was not a single event. It was the product of multiple converging factors. A La Niña weather pattern that reduced precipitation across the upper Midwest, climate change-driven shifts in rainfall distribution that have been progressively drying the western tributaries of the Mississippi system, and reduced snowpack in the northern reaches of the drainage basin that diminished spring runoff. The effects cascaded downstream. The Missouri River, which contributes approximately 45% of the Mississippi's flow at St. Louis, ran low. The Ohio River, which contributes most of the remaining volume, also ran below normal. The Arkansas, the Red, and the tributary systems that feed the lower Mississippi all delivered less water than the river needed to maintain its normal levels. The gauges began recording readings that had never been seen. In October 2022, the Memphis gauge recorded 10.81 FT below the gauge's zero reference, the lowest reading in that station's recorded history. That negative number did not mean the river was dry. River gauge readings are measured relative to an arbitrary 0 point established when the gauge was installed. A reading of 1081 FT below that reference meant the water level was nearly 11 FT below that reference, lower than it had been at any time since continuous measurement began. Vicksburg, Natchez, and Baton Rouge also set new low records. The entire lower Mississippi was draining away. The navigation crisis that followed made national news. The Mississippi carries approximately 60% of American grain exports. Barges loaded with corn, soybeans, and wheat moved down the river to the Gulf ports, where the cargo is transferred to ocean-going vessels for shipment to global markets. The system is efficient, cost-effective, and completely dependent on the river maintaining sufficient depth for barge traffic. When the water dropped, the barges started running aground. The Corps of Engineers scrambled to respond. Dredging operations ran around the clock, cutting emergency channels through sandbars that had risen to block the navigation corridor. Barge companies reduced their loads, floating vessels higher in the water to reduce draft. Shipping schedules collapsed. Grain backed up in storage facilities across the Midwest waiting for water that was not coming. The economic disruption was severe. The agricultural disruption was severe. The saltwater intrusion was worse. In 2023, the Mississippi's outflow to the Gulf of Mexico dropped so low that the physics of the river's terminus began to reverse. Normally, the fresh water of the Mississippi pushes against the salt water of the Gulf, maintaining a boundary that keeps ocean water out of the river channel. The weight and volume of the river's flow prevents intrusion. When the flow dropped below critical thresholds, the Gulf began pushing back. Salt water crept upstream, past the delta marshes, past the lower parishes, past the intake pipes that supply drinking water to communities along the river's final miles. New Orleans faced a drinking water crisis. The city's water supply is drawn from the Mississippi. When salt water reaches the intake pipes, the treatment plants cannot remove the salt using standard filtration. The water becomes undrinkable. Emergency measures were implemented. The Corps constructed an underwater sill, a barrier of sediment designed to block the denser saltwater from advancing upstream. Federal resources were deployed. The crisis was managed. But the fundamental problem remained. The river was lower than it had ever been in recorded history, and as the water retreated, the riverbed began to emerge. The Brook Hill Ferry was one of the first major discoveries. Near Memphis, as the river dropped through the autumn of 2022, the remains of a 19th-century steam ferry began appearing above the waterline. Wooden hull timbers, corroded metal fittings, and the structural bones of a vessel that had gone down over a century ago and had not been seen since. Local historians identified the wreck as the Brook Hill, a ferry that had operated in the Memphis area in the late 1800s. The vessel's loss had been documented in contemporary records, but its exact location had been unknown. The river had buried it, moved over it, and hidden it beneath decades of accumulated sediment. Now it was visible. People began walking out to look at it, wading through the shallows to examine timbers that had been underwater for over 100 years. The Brook Hill was not unique. As the low water continued through 2022 and into 2023, additional wrecks began emerging along the length of the river. Near St. Louis, wooden cargo hulls from the 19th century Mosquito fleet, the swarm of small vessels that had carried goods along the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers appeared on exposed sandbars. Near Vicksburg, Civil War-era wreckage that had been lost during the famous siege began showing above the waterline. The river was revealing its inventory, and the inventory was larger than anyone had anticipated. The Civil War connections are among the most significant. The Mississippi was the strategic prize of the Western theater. Control of the river meant control of the continent. The Confederacy's ability to maintain communication and supply lines between its eastern and western territories depended on holding the Mississippi. The Union's ability to strangle the Confederacy economically and militarily depended on taking it. The campaigns fought along the river at Island No. 10, at Memphis, at Vicksburg, at Port Hudson produced some of the most consequential naval engagements of the war, and they produced wreckage. The USS Cairo is the most famous example. The Cairo was a Union ironclad, a city-class gunboat that had participated in the campaign to open the Mississippi to Union traffic. On December 12, 1862, while operating in the Yazoo River, a tributary of the Mississippi near Vicksburg, the Cairo struck a Confederate torpedo, what today we call a mine, and sank in 12 minutes. The Cairo was the first vessel in history to be sunk by an electrically detonated mine. It lay on the bottom of the Yazoo for over a century before being located and raised in 1964. The vessel is now on display at Vicksburg National Military Park, preserved as one of the most complete Civil War naval artifacts in existence. But the Cairo was not alone. The Vicksburg campaign alone produced dozens of vessel losses: Union gunboats, Confederate rams, transport ships, supply vessels, and the countless smaller craft that supported operations on both sides. Many of these wrecks have never been located. They lie somewhere in the river system, buried under the sediment that has accumulated over 160 years. The recent low water has left some wrecks exposed. The identifications are ongoing. Federal archaeologists, state historic preservation offices, and academic researchers have been working to document what is emerging before the water rises again and covers it. The window is temporary. The river will return to normal levels eventually. Climate patterns will shift. Precipitation will increase. The wrecks that are visible now will be buried again. Possibly for another century. Possibly forever. The documentation work is urgent. The human remains are the most difficult part of the story. As the riverbed has emerged, bodies have emerged with it. Some of them are recent. The Mississippi has been a dumping ground for murder victims, accident casualties, and suicide cases throughout its history. Bodies that enter the river are carried downstream, eventually sinking when decomposition gases escape and the remains lose buoyancy. They settle into the sediment. They are buried. They remain. When the water drops low enough, they reappear. Law enforcement agencies along the river have been recovering human remains from the exposed riverbed since 2022. Some cases have been connected to known missing persons reports, individuals who disappeared in circumstances that suggested the river might have been involved, but whose bodies had never been found. Other cases are older. Some of the remains that have emerged appear to be historical, skeletal material that has been in the river for decades or longer. The condition of the bones, the context of the discovery, the absence of any matching missing persons report from the modern era, all suggest that these are the bodies of people who died a very long time ago. Some of them may be from the 19th century. The river took a lot of people in the 19th century. Steamboat disasters alone killed thousands. The Sultana explosion of April 27, 1865, the deadliest maritime disaster in American history at the time, killed approximately 100 to 800 Union soldiers who were returning home from Confederate prison camps. The vessel was grotesquely overloaded. Its boilers were in poor condition, and when the explosion came, the passengers had almost no chance of survival. Many Sultana victims were never recovered. Their bodies were carried downstream by the current, eventually sinking into the river that had killed them. Some of those bodies may still be down there. The 1840 Great Natchez tornado killed approximately 317 people, many of them on the river, aboard the flatboats and steamers that were tied up at the Natchez waterfront when the storm struck. Bodies were carried away by the current. Many were never found. The New Madrid earthquakes from 1811 to 1812, the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of the continental United States east of the Rocky Mountains, literally reshaped the Mississippi's channel. Vessels sank. People drowned. The river swallowed whatever fell into it during those cataclysmic weeks, and the sediment that followed buried the evidence. The historical body count is incalculable, and some of those bodies are now being exposed. The indigenous archaeological dimension has been largely unreported. The Mississippi River Valley has been inhabited for over 10,000 years. The mound-building cultures of the pre-Columbian era, Poverty Point, the Hopewell tradition, and the Mississippian culture that built Cahokia, occupied the river corridor for millennia before European contact. Their settlements lined the river's banks. Their trade networks used the river as a highway, and their dead were buried in mounds that, in many cases, the river has since eroded, flooded, and absorbed. The exposed riverbed contains artifacts, pottery fragments, stone tools, the accumulated material culture of thousands of years of human occupation washed into the river by floods, buried by channel migration, and now exposed by unprecedented low water. The Choctaw Nation and the Chickasaw Nation, and other tribal authorities with ancestral connections to the Mississippi Valley, have been coordinating with federal and state agencies on the treatment of materials that emerge from the riverbed. This work is deeply tribal, and legal, ethical, and cultural sensitivity is required. The work is sensitive. Some of what is emerging may include human remains from indigenous burials. The legal frameworks governing such discoveries include the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, which requires consultation with tribal authorities before remains can be excavated, studied, or moved. Coordination is ongoing. Documentation is incomplete, and the river continues to reveal what it has been holding. The cargo recoveries have attracted the most public attention. 19th-century commercial goods have been emerging from the riverbed in quantities that amateur collectors and professional archaeologists alike have found remarkable. Glass bottles are among the most common finds. The steamboats and flatboats that carried goods along the river routinely lost cargo overboard through accident, through storm damage, and through the general chaos of 19th-century river commerce. Bottles that sank to the riverbed were buried by sediment and preserved in anaerobic conditions that prevented deterioration. The low water has exposed them. Intact bottles from the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s have been recovered from exposed sandbars along the lower Mississippi. Some bear makers' marks that allow precise dating. Some retain traces of their original contents. Some are worth significant money to collectors who specialize in historical glassware. The legal status of these recoveries is ambiguous. The riverbed belongs to the states through which the river flows or to the federal government in navigable channels. Objects embedded in the riverbed are technically the property of the landowner, which in most cases means the state. Removing artifacts without permission is, strictly speaking, illegal. Enforcement has been inconsistent. The exposed areas are vast. Authorities are overwhelmed. The window of exposure is temporary. People are taking what they find, and the archaeological record is being scattered before professionals can document it. The losses are significant. Every bottle removed from its context without documentation is a data point lost. Every artifact taken by a collector is a piece of the historical record that can no longer be studied in situ. The river is revealing its secrets. People are grabbing what they can before the water returns. The infrastructure implications extend beyond archaeology. The old river control structure is one of the most critical pieces of flood control infrastructure in the United States, and the recent low water has stressed it in ways that engineers are still assessing. The structure exists to prevent the Mississippi from doing what rivers naturally do: change course. The Mississippi has changed course many times over geological history. The river's delta has shifted back and forth across the Louisiana coastline, building and abandoning lobes of land as the channel found new paths to the Gulf. The current path of the Mississippi past New Orleans and through the Birdfoot Delta is not the river's natural preference. Given the choice, the Mississippi would abandon its current channel and flow down the Atchafalaya Basin, a shorter, steeper route to the Gulf that the river began trying to adopt in the 20th century. The old river control structure, completed in 1963, prevents this. The structure regulates the amount of water that can flow from the Mississippi into the Atchafalaya, maintaining a division of approximately 70% Mississippi and 30% Atchafalaya. If the structure failed, if the Mississippi captured the Atchafalaya Channel completely, the consequences would be catastrophic. New Orleans would be stranded on a saltwater estuary. The petrochemical corridor between Baton Rouge and the Gulf would lose its freshwater supply. Billions of dollars of infrastructure would be rendered useless. The recent low water has affected the old river control structure's operating conditions. The details are technical, and the Corps of Engineers has not been fully transparent about the extent of the stress. But the fundamental reality is clear. The river is behaving in ways that the infrastructure was not designed to accommodate. The system was built for a river that fluctuated within historical norms. The river is now fluctuating outside those norms. The system is being tested. Mark Twain understood the river's nature. His 1883 book, Life on the Mississippi, documented the river as it existed in the late 19th century. A living, restless, constantly changing waterway that defied human attempts to control it. Twain described the river's tendency to cut new channels, abandon old ones, swallow towns that had been built too close to its banks, and reveal land that had been underwater for decades. He documented the pilots who navigated by memory and experience, who knew that the river they had learned last year might not be the river they would find this year. The river was never stable. The river was never safe. The river was a force that humans used but could not control. A power that would tolerate human presence on its banks, but would never be tamed by human engineering. The 20th century attempted to prove Twain wrong. The levee system, the flood control reservoirs, the navigation locks, the old river control structure, the billions of dollars of federal investment in infrastructure were all designed to make the Mississippi behave. The 21st century is testing whether that investment was sufficient. The droughts from 2022 to 2024 are not anomalies. Climate models predict that the precipitation patterns that feed the Mississippi will become more variable, longer droughts interrupted by more intense floods. The river will swing between extremes that the existing infrastructure was not designed to handle. The low water will return. The wrecks will be exposed again. The bodies will emerge again. The cargo will wash out of the sediment again. And each time the river will be revealing something that Americans thought they had buried, literally and figuratively. The towns that disappeared are part of the story. The Mississippi's channel migration has erased entire communities over the past 2 centuries. The Mississippi has never stayed in one place for very long. Over the decades, its channel has wandered across the landscape, constantly reshaping the land around it. Communities that stood proudly on the river's edge in the early 1800s sometimes found themselves miles away from the water by the end of the century. Once busy ports became isolated farming towns after the river abandoned them, taking their trade and prosperity with it. For others, the opposite happened. Instead of moving away, the Mississippi moved closer. Its powerful current slowly carved into the shoreline, weakening foundations year after year until entire sections of land collapsed into the water. Homes disappeared. Churches slipped beneath the current. Warehouses, streets, and businesses vanished as the river consumed everything in its path. Some residents escaped in time. Others never had the chance. Today's unusually low water levels have uncovered traces of several of these forgotten settlements. Weathered stone foundations, broken bricks, and scattered pieces of old buildings are appearing where the river hid them for generations. Many of these communities were small, and their histories existed only in local records. When the towns disappeared, much of their story disappeared as well. Now, for a brief moment, the river is allowing those stories to be seen again. Historians know this opportunity won't last. Once seasonal rains return and water levels rise, these remains will once again disappear beneath layers of mud and sediment, perhaps for decades or even centuries. Across the exposed riverbed, visitors, historians, photographers, and archaeologists are walking across ground that has remained underwater for generations, documenting discoveries before nature hides them once again. Some researchers have also turned their attention to another chapter of American history connected to the Mississippi. During the 19th century, the river served as both a pathway and a barrier. For many enslaved people seeking freedom, crossing the Mississippi could mean entering territories where different laws and support networks offered hope for escape. The journey was incredibly dangerous. Some successfully crossed. Others were captured before reaching safety. Many lost their lives in the powerful current. At the same time, the river played a central role in the domestic slave trade. Before the Civil War, countless enslaved men, women, and children were transported south aboard riverboats to markets in New Orleans, where they were sold and separated from their families. These voyages treated human beings as cargo, packed onto the same vessels that carried cotton, timber, grain, and manufactured goods. Not every voyage reached its destination. Some of those boats were destroyed by storms, accidents, fires, or collisions. When they sank, many of the people aboard disappeared beneath the water and were never recovered. In countless cases, their names and identities were never preserved in official records. Because of that history, Archaeologists recognize that some discoveries emerging from the riverbed may be connected to those forgotten tragedies. Confirming identities is extremely difficult, and investigations continue with great care and respect. Many questions remain unanswered. What is certain is that the Mississippi has preserved an extraordinary record of America's past. Hidden beneath its muddy waters are the remains of steamboats from the 1850s, Civil War-era warships, cargo lost during the nation's westward expansion, abandoned settlements, and countless artifacts left behind by generations who depended on this river for survival. The current drought has simply lifted the curtain. This window won't stay open forever. Eventually the rains will return. Water levels will rise. Fresh layers of sediment will once again blanket the wrecks, ruins, and artifacts that have briefly reappeared. Much of what can be seen today may remain hidden for another generation before nature reveals it again. For now, however, the Mississippi is exposing pieces of history that few people ever expected to witness. Thousands of shipwrecks, forgotten communities, lost cargo, centuries of untold stories resting beneath one of the world's greatest rivers. Researchers continue documenting every discovery, mapping newly exposed sites, and carefully investigating each clue before the river claims it once more. Somewhere between Memphis and the Gulf of Mexico, beneath drying mud and cracked riverbanks, there are almost certainly more secrets waiting to emerge. For generations, the Mississippi carried them away. Then it guarded them in silence. Now, little by little, it is revealing them again. And every new discovery is rewriting another small piece of American history.